Jaime Lannister stood in the dim torchlight of the Red Keep's underbelly, the murmur of distant water echoing off the damp stone walls. The air smelled of mold and old straw, mingled with the reek of stale sweat. It was impossible to guess how many men had wasted away in these cells before dying in obscurity. He had never expected Ned Stark to be among them. Yet here he was, the Lord of Winterfell, dirty and slumped against a wall, a single guttering torch illuminating his bruised features. Jaime felt his stomach knot. He couldn't quite recall when he had started to doubt Cersei, to feel the seeds of distrust take root. Perhaps it was the moment Joffrey ascended the Iron Throne, dripping with the blood of the chaos left in King Robert's wake. Or perhaps it was earlier, when he and Cersei had been whispering in King Robert's bedchamber as the king lay dying, and he had seen something in her eyes, something ruthless, sharpened by fear, that he didn't quite recognize. There had always been a darkness in her, a cunning drive, but as her power grew, so did her willingness to commit unspeakable acts. He stared at the man who had once been his adversary on the battlefield. Ned Stark was more skeleton than Lord now, yet pride still radiated from him in an almost palpable aura. Jaime wondered if Ned realized how close he was to execution. The city was in a frenzy after Robert's death. The Queen Regent's hold on power was tenuous. Cersei was orchestrating everything from the shadows in some ways and openly in others. The next sunrise could easily see Ned Stark's head on a spike. Jaime's conscience pricked him more sharply than he cared to admit. A single iron key in his gloved hand weighed more than any sword he'd ever wielded. Its ridges bit into his palm as if telling him, "This is a decision you cannot undo." He turned it between his fingers, recalling years of arrogance, father's commands, the sense of Lannister pride. But those ideas felt hollow now, overshadowed by the madness of Joffrey's cruelty, the unpredictability of the small council, the rumors swirling that the realm was ready to tear itself apart. Honor was not something Jaime had ever embraced. He had been the Kingslayer, scorned by the entire kingdom, known for breaking oaths. But in this moment, he stood at a crossroads that might shape the future of the Seven Kingdoms. With a slow, deliberate motion, Jaime approached the door to Ned Stark's cell and slid the key into the lock. It squealed in protest, as if the very metal itself opposed what was about to happen. He pushed, turned. The lock clicked. Ned's eyes snapped open, focusing on Jaime's face. An expression of disbelief flickered across them, shadowed by suspicion. He was expecting something else. Another guard come to torment him, perhaps a visit from a Lannister agent who'd dangle mercy in front of him like a carrot. But Jaime said nothing at first. He simply pulled the door open and stepped into the cell, shining the torch close enough to show Ned's features clearly. Ned struggled to stand, bracing himself against the stone wall. The clank of chains and the rawness around his wrists made Jaime grimace. Though they had been on opposite sides of nearly every conflict, Jaime found no thrill in seeing the man reduced to this state. He bent down and unlocked Ned's manacles. Silence choked the corridor until the metal dropped to the ground with a dull clang. Finally, Ned managed to find his voice. "What is the meaning of this?" he rasped. His voice was hoarse, as if from screaming or thirst. He eyed Jaime with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. Jaime, never one to shrink from confrontation, tried to keep his voice steady. "You've been scheduled for execution in the morning. The orders come from the Queen Regent and from King Joffrey himself. What do you think I'm doing here?" He paused. "I'm giving you a chance to live." Ned took an unsteady step toward him. The flickering light danced across his gray eyes, and Jaime could see a storm of emotion there. Anger, regret, confusion. "Why would you risk everything to free me?" "Because," Jaime said, forcing a lightness he didn't feel, "my sister and I have come to a parting of the ways, and I'm not convinced the realm benefits from the Starks being slaughtered like trapped animals. We have enough trouble with the North already. Killing you would set the wolves howling for vengeance. It would rip the kingdom apart." He swallowed. "Maybe it's more selfish than that. Maybe I'm just tired of being the man everyone hates for doing the dirty work." Ned's gaze was unyielding, as though he were measuring Jaime's words. The Lord of Winterfell had always been known for his sense of honor. Jaime had once mocked that, envied it even. But in this moment, it was a currency that Jaime found himself coveting. Ned finally nodded. "And you would trust me to leave King's Landing and let you be?" Jaime shrugged, trying not to show the slip of his own fears. "One way or another, the real war is coming. If you truly want peace, there is none to be had under Joffrey's reign, not as it stands now. And if you wish to see your daughters safe, well, trust might be your only chance." He extended his arm, offering Ned his own battered cloak from over his shoulder. "Throw this on. We need to move quickly." Ned let out a shaky breath. Then he accepted the cloak. The rough fabric felt like a pittance, but the warmth of it stirred some life into his limbs. He said nothing more. Words seemed useless right then. Explanations, justifications, they would come later. For now, it was enough that the cell door stood open and Jaime Lannister was holding a torch, guiding him toward a corridor of possibility rather than a chopping block on the morrow. They crept through the winding halls, their footsteps echoing in the hush of midnight. Each corner threatened a patrolling guard. More than once, Jaime signaled for Ned to press against the wall while he stepped ahead to peer around the next turn. They were a strange pair, two men known for their prowess in battle, forced to resort to subterfuge. Jaime's heart pounded with each step, certain that if they were caught, 1,000 swords would descend on them. But the Red Keep was vast, its labyrinthine corridors used to hosting every manner of secret. It was only when they reached a small courtyard, open to the night sky, that they paused to catch a breath. Ned looked up, as though seeing the stars for the first time in years, even though his imprisonment had not been that long. Still, to a man who cherished open spaces and crisp northern air, this had felt like a lifetime. Jaime closed the door behind them, setting the torch aside and letting the darkness cloak them. "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice low. He'd spent hours arranging a boat, a small vessel moored in the shallows off the Blackwater Rush, manned by a loyal retainer of the Lannister household who was as disgruntled with Cersei's antics as Jaime was. Yet something pulled at Jaime's mind, a single question that weighed on his conscience, heavier than the key he had turned in the cell door. What of Sansa Stark? What of Arya? He had seen them in the castle, or at least Sansa, whose pleas for her father's life had gone unheeded. He had no clue where Arya was. She had vanished sometime after Ned's arrest. If Ned left now, would he abandon them to the Lannisters' mercy? Would he stay to fight for them, or would that doom him outright? Jaime had not planned on how to free them, too. That was a complication he might have to face soon, though. The notion pressed him, guilt needling him. Could he bear the idea of letting a daughter remain captive while her father slipped away? As if guessing his thoughts, Ned halted in the courtyard's gloom. His posture stiffened. "My daughters." The words were a strangled whisper. "I can't leave without them." He stared at Jaime, and for a moment Jaime thought he saw a flicker of real desperation. "Sansa's in the castle somewhere. Arya, I don't even know. But I can't abandon them." Jaime set his jaw. He felt a surge of frustration, not with Ned, but with the impossible predicament. "I know where Sansa is. She's essentially a prisoner, though she still believes she's betrothed to Joffrey. Arya vanished after your arrest, but the Gold Cloaks are searching for her. There's talk she might be in Flea Bottom or hidden by some loyal household knight." His voice was low, taut. "There's no easy way to free Sansa. She's watched by guards loyal to the Queen. If I try to pull the same stunt I just did, I risk condemnation by the entire Kingsguard. Not to mention, Sansa might not trust me, and her presence will slow us. The guards will notice if a highborn lady goes missing." Ned's cheeks hollowed under the flickering starlight. "My daughters mean more to me than my own life. I won't leave them in King's Landing, especially not with Joffrey. If it comes to it, I'll face him at dawn. Better to die with a sword in my hand than run away like a coward." Jaime exhaled, feeling the weight of that statement. It was exactly the sort of stubborn honor he expected of Ned Stark. The man would charge headlong into danger without a second thought for personal survival if it meant protecting his family. Something about it made Jaime's chest tighten. With the faint glow of moonlight washing over them, Jaime stepped closer. "We'll get Sansa, but we must be clever or we'll all be dead by sunrise. Trust me on this, Ned." He let out a humorless laugh. "My father will doubtless brand me a traitor for this. Cersei will do worse than that if she can." Ned nodded once, acknowledging the magnitude of the gesture. "Let's go," he said, and so the unlikely pair continued across the courtyard, heading for the interior of Maegor's Holdfast where they believed Sansa was lodged. The Red Keep was quieter than usual, but that did not mean it was unguarded. At every turn, gold cloaks or Lannister guards stood watch. Jaime counted on his armor and his presence, though he discarded his white cloak for a simpler black tabard that concealed him in the corridors. He knew that if any guard recognized him, they might not question the Kingslayer's movements at first. The advantage of being the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard was that no one truly outranked him except the king. But if any had orders to keep Ned Stark locked up, seeing him at Jaime's side would raise immediate alarm. When they were within sight of the Queen's apartments, a cluster of chambers that included the suite where Sansa was housed, a voice behind them made Jaime's blood run cold. "Ser Jaime? Didn't expect to see you here at this hour." It was Ser Meryn Trant, flanked by 2 gold cloaks, rounding the corner. The torches sputtered along the corridor walls, casting flickering shadows across the ornate tapestry of a hunting scene. Ser Meryn's eyes flicked to Ned, who had lowered his head in an attempt to remain unseen. The older knight's brow furrowed. "Who is that?" Jaime stepped forward smoothly, angling himself so that the corridor's gloom swallowed Ned's face. "New recruit," Jaime lied, voice steady. "I'm taking him to speak with the Queen's steward about special duties." Ser Meryn blinked, suspicion crossing his features. "He looks battered. Or drunk. Are you certain?" Jaime hardened his tone, letting the arrogance that once defined him seep out. "You dare question me? I didn't realize you'd grown so bold, Ser Meryn." He gestured dismissively. "Go attend your post. King Joffrey can't spare you wandering aimlessly." Jaime's hand drifted casually to the pommel of his sword, a gesture that made the gold cloaks behind Ser Meryn exchange nervous glances. Even if Ser Meryn outranked them, Jaime was still a Lannister, a formidable name that commanded a certain dread. Ser Meryn seemed taken aback but acquiesced with a curt bow. "Of course, Ser Jaime. I only meant to watch for intruders. Good evening." He motioned for his men to move on. Jaime did not move until they were out of sight, footprints fading into the corridor's distance. Ned let out a low breath. Jaime understood his relief. One more question, one more second of doubt, and the entire plan would have been undone. They forged ahead, determined not to linger. Jaime led Ned to a narrow stairwell that spiraled upward, a rarely used passage that connected the servants' quarters to a side antechamber near Cersei's rooms. He had used it once or twice in the past to slip in or out of the Queen's bedchamber unnoticed, back when their illicit relationship was a closely guarded secret. The memory made him swallow. That time felt like a lifetime ago. They found the antechamber deserted, as Jaime had hoped. It was a small, square room with a single door leading out into a corridor where a handful of guards were usually posted. Through that door was a short hallway leading to Sansa's chamber. Jaime placed an ear to the thick wood, listening. He could make out the muffled sound of voices, a guard or two perhaps exchanging idle chatter. Candlelight flickered beneath the door. He held up a hand to warn Ned, then leaned closer. "How do you propose we handle them?" Ned murmured, keeping his voice just barely above a breath. Jaime considered their options. 2 guards, probably. Maybe 3. Sansa's door would be locked from the outside, but the key might be with one of them or stashed on a table nearby. Deception might work again until it didn't. If swords were drawn, the noise would bring more. Still, there was no time to dawdle. Dawn was creeping ever closer. "Follow my lead," Jaime said. "And if it goes badly, be ready to fight." Ned nodded, squaring his shoulders. Jaime opened the door and stepped out confidently, nodding to the pair of gold cloaks who flanked Sansa's chamber door. They stiffened at once upon seeing him, but not from alarm. Rather, from the reflexive deference a mere foot soldier offers a knight of the Kingsguard. By the faint light of wall sconces, Jaime made out the confusion in their eyes at the sight of the tall, cloaked figure behind him. But he pressed on before they could ask questions. "I need to speak with the girl," Jaime announced. "Move aside." One of the guards, a stocky man with a faint scar across his chin, swallowed. "The Queen's orders are that no one is to disturb Lady Sansa except with her explicit permission." Jaime fixed him with a cold stare. "I am the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, chosen by King Joffrey himself. Since when does a guard obey the Queen over the Kingsguard? Don't make me repeat myself." His words were laced with disdain. He could all but feel Ned tensing behind him. The guard hesitated, opening his mouth as though to protest. But Jaime's hand was already on the hilt of his sword. His glare told them everything they needed to know. Either step aside or face the lethal consequences. They glanced at each other and stepped back, but the scarred guard's eyes lingered on Ned, suspicious. Jaime prayed the corridor's weak light and Ned's lowered head would be enough to fool them. Without another word, Jaime tried the door. It was locked. He extended a hand to the guard, letting arrogance surge through him once more. "The key," he said tersely. The guard fished a small iron key from his belt pouch and handed it over. Jaime could sense the guard's reluctance, so he wasted no time. He slid the key into the lock, twisted until it clicked, and shouldered the door open. With Ned close on his heels, Jaime stepped into the dimly lit room and shut the door behind him, turning the key again. That left the guards outside, presumably at the threshold, likely anxious but unwilling to disobey the Kingslayer. Jaime counted that as a small advantage, though it wouldn't last if the Queen herself gave different orders. By the glow of a single candle burning on the table near the bed, they saw Sansa Stark seated near the window, dressed in a simple shift. Her eyes shot up in surprise, and Jaime saw that those eyes were red-rimmed with tears, her face drawn with worry. She had likely been weeping, knowing her father's fate. At the sight of Jaime, she paled, but upon seeing the cloaked figure behind him, she stood, nearly stumbling over the hem of her nightdress. "Father?" she whispered, a tremor in her voice. "Is that?" Her words caught and Ned lifted his head. The candlelight revealed the bruises, the exhaustion written in every line of his face, but also a desperate joy that mirrored hers. "It's me, Sansa," Ned managed, voice cracked. "Be quiet, child. We haven't much time." She was at his side in a heartbeat, pressing her face into his chest, sobbing in silent relief. Ned embraced her, ignoring the pain in his limbs, ignoring everything but the fact that his daughter was safe enough to hold for this moment. Jaime stepped away, feeling a knot in his throat he refused to acknowledge. He had never known such paternal devotion. Tyrion had always been the clever one, never in need of rescue from their father. Cersei, he cared for her in a different, twisted way. And Tommen, Myrcella, Joffrey, well, those were complicated stories wrapped in too many lies. But here was a father reunited with his daughter, a simpler, more honest love than Jaime had ever tasted in his own life. Ned gently pulled Sansa away, enough to look at her face. "We're leaving," he whispered. "Jaime Lannister has offered us a way out, but you must trust him. There's no time for questions." Sansa's lips parted in confusion, and Jaime expected a torrent of hysterics. Why would the man who had once ambushed her father outside Littlefinger's brothel do anything to help them? Yet in that moment, she simply nodded, tears still tracing her cheeks. "Yes, father. If it means we can go home." Ned glanced at Jaime. "We need to see if Arya is anywhere in the castle," he said quietly. "I can't leave her behind." Jaime had already begun to anticipate this argument. "We'll look, but we have almost no hope of finding her by wandering the halls. Do you have any idea where she might have gone?" "She disappeared before I could." He paused, swallowing the flicker of shame. He had done nothing to help a little girl, only now realizing how monstrous that was. "Before she vanished," he finished lamely. Ned hesitated. "The last I knew, Syrio Farrell, her dancing master, was with her. He's probably dead." but Arya would head for safety, possibly out of the castle, maybe among the crowds near the dragon pit. She might try to hide in Flea Bottom or near the city gates. She knows enough of the sword to defend herself for a little while. But we don't have time to comb the city, Jaime said. I've a boat waiting. Dawn is too close, and you know if we don't move soon, Cersei will discover your escape. He frowned, seeing Ned's troubled expression. I know you love her, but your best chance to protect her is to escape yourself. Gather your bannermen and come back stronger. Staying here will only ensure your death and Sansa's. If Arya is still in the city, she's cunning. She'll survive. Or the rumors might be true that Yoren of the Night's Watch scooped her up. I don't know, but we can't help her if we're dead. Ned closed his eyes, torn. Sansa stood trembling at his side, her small hand gripping his tattered sleeve. Jaime looked away, letting Ned wrestle with the impossibility. But at last, Ned nodded, his voice tight with suppressed grief. You're right. I can't let Sansa fall into harm's way. Arya, gods be good. She'll have to fend for herself until I can return. A muffled voice sounded from outside the door. Ser Jaime? The guards again, uneasy with the locked door. Is everything all right in there? Jaime shot Ned a warning glance, then called out, Everything's fine. The girl was asleep. Stand at your posts. He tried to keep the impatience out of his tone. Turning back to Ned, he lowered his voice. We need to go. Now. Ned gently guided Sansa forward. Her face was etched with worry, but she clung to her father's arm. They moved toward the door, which Jaime unlocked quietly. He opened it a crack and met the questioning gazes of the two guards. Lady Sansa wishes to gather some personal effects, Jaime lied. Will only be a moment. The scarred guard's eyes flicked to Ned, but with the cloak and the shadowy corridor, it was not immediately obvious who he was. Still, something must have pricked the guard's suspicion. Begging your pardon, Ser Jaime? But the Queen! Jaime's hand lashed out, grabbing the guard by the neck with lightning speed. He slammed the man's head into the wall, the muffled thunk echoing down the corridor. The second guard, caught off guard, reached for his sword, but Ned was faster. Even weak as he was, he retained a soldier's reflexes. He barreled into the man, knocking him off balance. The guard stumbled, and Ned's knee drove into his abdomen. Jaime drew his blade in a swift motion and brought the pommel down on the guard's temple. The man collapsed in a heap. Sansa clapped a hand over her mouth, suppressing a cry. Jaime pressed his ear to the corridor, listening intently for any sign the commotion had drawn others. Silence. He let out a breath. Help me with them, he said, kneeling to drag the unconscious guard into the bedchamber. Ned did the same with the other. They dropped them near the bed, quickly bound their hands and feet with strips torn from the curtains, and gagged them. Sansa stood out of the way, shaking as she watched the men handle the guards with ruthless efficiency. Once finished, Jaime pointed down the corridor. We'll take the same route back. If anyone stops us, I'll do the talking. Sansa, keep your head down. He glanced at Ned. And keep her behind you. Let's go. They slipped through the corridor as quietly as possible, taking the back stairwell down to the courtyard. Sansa's terror was palpable, but Ned whispered gentle reassurances whenever they paused. Jaime led them through a series of side passages until they reached the massive portcullis that opened onto the yard leading to the stables. At this hour, only a skeleton crew of guards patrolled. But a single guard at a gate could be as dangerous as a dozen if alarm were raised. In the shadows, near an alcove stacked with barrels, Jaime paused and scanned the yard. We have to cross that open area to reach a postern gate that leads to the waterfront, he murmured. My contact is waiting there with a boat, or so I was promised. It's our only chance of slipping out without half the gold cloaks noticing. Move quietly. They crossed the yard, stepping through patches of moonlight and shadow. Sansa gripped Ned's hand, keeping pace despite her trembling. Jaime strode confidently, adopting the same posture he used in full daylight, as if no one would dare challenge him. For a few tense moments, it worked. Then the sound of a guard's voice halted them in their tracks. "Who's that?" came a call from the right, a figure stepping out from behind a stack of crates. He wore no house crest on his simple leather jerkin, likely one of the nighttime stable hands or a lesser guard. A small lantern dangled from his grasp, illuminating his suspicious face. Jaime turned briskly, a snarl of displeasure curling his lip. "Step aside," he said. "I'm on the king's business." The man raised his lantern, squinting. "At this hour? Who is that with you? That man looks like a prisoner." His gaze flicked to Ned's face, which was still half hidden by the cloak. "You have no banner. Where is your cloak, sir?" Before Jaime could answer, Ned tensed. He sensed their fragile deception unraveling. The stable hand's eyes narrowed as they fell on Sansa, who was clearly no servant or guard. Jaime cursed under his breath, gripping the hilt of his sword. "None of your concern. Get out of our way." But the man was already stepping back, alarmed. "Guards!" he shouted, turning as if to run. Jaime lunged, hooking an arm around the man's neck. The lantern fell, its light spilling across the ground, flickering dangerously as it threatened to ignite the straw. Jaime slammed the guard down, and Ned planted a foot on the man's chest. The fellow's cry cut off abruptly, but they could already hear distant shouts from the guards on the walls. "Quickly," Jaime rasped. He let the man's unconscious form slump into the shadows. "We have to move. Now they know something's amiss." They sprinted across the courtyard. At the far corner stood the postern gate, a small iron-bound door set into the wall. The sound of booted feet rang out from an approaching patrol. Jaime could see torchlight flickering in the gloom. It was only a matter of time before crossbow bolts flew or the alarm bells tolled. Gripping the heavy latch, Jaime gave a fierce tug. The door opened, revealing a narrow alleyway outside the Red Keep's main walls, leading toward the banks of the Blackwater Rush. They dashed into the alley, hearts pounding. The stench of the river mingled with the refuse scattered on the ground. It was a part of King's Landing seldom trod by nobles, a forgotten path used mostly by smugglers and cunning stewards who needed discreet deliveries. Jaime quickly scanned the darkness. A cloaked figure stood near the mouth of the alley, beside a rickety cart. When it saw them, it waved hesitantly. "That must be our man," Jaime said, guiding Ned and Sansa forward. He kept one hand on the hilt of his sword, ready for betrayal. The figure drew back its hood, revealing the pale, lined face of an older man who wore a small golden brooch pinned at his shoulder. Not a Lannister crest, but a discreet sign that Jaime recognized from previous dealings. "Sir Jaime?" the old man whispered, his tone anxious. "The boat is just down the embankment. You're late," I heard shouting from inside. "We must hurry." They followed him further into the night, skirting piles of rubble and stepping over puddles of foul water. The shape of a small boat emerged, its hull bobbing in the slight current, moored to a half-rotten pier. A single lantern, shielded by a metal plate, offered just enough light to see the deck. A shadowy figure stood at the stern, another ally Jaime had bribed. Behind them, the alarm from the Red Keep was rising, muffled but unmistakable. Lights began to flare along the battlements, horns blowing in short bursts. Ned assisted Sansa onto the boat, the old man holding it steady. Jaime followed, scanning the shoreline. No sign of soldiers yet. With luck, they had a few minutes before the gates closed and the search parties fanned out. As the boat rocked beneath them, Ned held Sansa close, pressing her face into his chest to keep her from trembling uncontrollably. Jaime motioned to the boatman. "Cast off," he said, voice tight. The man nodded, pulling in the line and pushing off the pier. The craft began to glide across the inky water. Moonlight reflected off the ripples, and as Jaime looked back, he saw the flickering torches on the walls of the Red Keep, heard the faint clamoring of shouts as the guards discovered the gate or the unconscious men. They were too far now for crossbows to be effective in the dark. So far, so good. He turned and found Ned watching him. In Ned's stare, Jaime saw an odd mixture of gratitude, suspicion, and wariness. Neither man spoke for a moment, letting the hush of the river fill the space. Then Ned finally said, You saved us tonight, Sansa and me. I won't forget it." Jaime bristled slightly at the sincerity. It was unfamiliar territory for him to be on the receiving end of a Stark's gratitude. "Don't mistake me for a hero," he said, voice low. "I did this as much for my own reasons as for your sake. Things in King's Landing are worse than you know." Ned nodded grimly. "I won't question your motives for now. But you're right, if Joffrey kills me, the North will never submit peacefully. And if the realm fractures, we'll all drown in blood." Sansa sniffled, looking up at her father, then at Jaime. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice trembling. Jaime found himself strangely disarmed by the sincerity of her words. "We're not safe yet. The city is just the beginning." He turned his gaze toward the black waters. "We'll row to a safer cove, then ride north. Or perhaps you have a different plan, Lord Stark." Ned swallowed, his battered features set in a hard line. "I'll need to rally my bannermen. That means heading to Moat Cailin to secure the neck first. But the Lannisters might move against us before we get that far. The roads are filled with the King's men, and your father, Tywin, is no friend of mine. If he hears you've freed me, he'll wage war in the blink of an eye." Jaime grimaced. "He's probably waging war already. The moment he hears of Robert's death and your arrest, he'll be mobilizing. There's no love lost between us either, but he's still my father. Yet I have no illusions that he'll side with me on this." He paused, letting the gravity sink in. "We'll have to rely on speed and discretion. Luckily, I have gold, enough to buy the silence of a few men along the way. Once we're far enough from King's Landing, your men can escort you the rest of the journey north." Ned let out a shuddering breath. The reflection of the moon across the water accented the lines of exhaustion on his face. "What about you?" he asked. "Are you just delivering us? Or do you intend to stand against your sister?" Jaime stared into the river. He had never fully considered the ramifications of defying Cersei openly. This was more than a lover's quarrel. This was treason in the eyes of the crown. Part of him still reeled from the fact that he had gone so far. "I don't know what the future holds," he said quietly, the swirl of the current lapping against the boat's hull. "But I know I can't stand by and watch Joffrey, the boy, tear the kingdom apart. And I won't be a puppet for Cersei anymore." Sansa's gaze shifted between them, eyes wide with fear, but also a glimmer of determination. Ned rested a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort. No one spoke for a few moments, each lost in the enormity of what they had done and what was yet to come. They passed beneath a looming arch where the city walls met the river, drifting out of King's Landing's direct shadow. On the far side, the water widened, reflecting the open night sky. It was a small mercy that no patrol boats had yet emerged. The boatman guided them along the shoreline for about half a league, eventually pulling up to a secluded stretch of muddy bank. Jaime hopped out first, water lapping at his boots, and helped Sansa and Ned onto the shore. The old man and the second figure began hauling the boat further up to tether it around an old post half buried in the mud. Ned looked around at the dark, tangled brush beyond the shore. In the distance, a few lights twinkled, likely farmsteads or fisherfolk's huts. "Where are the horses?" he asked, a tinge of urgency in his voice. "They should be just beyond that tree line," Jaime said, pointing to a stand of gnarled willows. "I had them brought here earlier in the evening. If they're still there, we'll have enough for all of us." Sure enough, when they crept through the thick grasses and reeds, they found 3 horses tethered to a low branch. They stamped nervously at the traveler's approach, but Jaime soothed them with practiced ease. The old man caught up, panting slightly. "So this is where I leave you, Ser Jaime?" Jaime turned to him, drawing a small pouch from his belt. He handed it over. "That should be enough gold to ensure your silence. If you speak of this, I'll know." The threat was unspoken but understood. The old man bobbed his head and stepped back. "I keep my vows to those who pay. The gold is enough. Farewell." He and his companion trudged back toward the boat. Jaime took a moment to gather himself. Ned helped Sansa onto one of the calmer mares, then swung up behind her. Jaime mounted his own steed, wincing at the aches in his body. Wounds from battles past still pained him, though not as severely as Ned's battered form must ache. In a final glance, Jaime took in the distant ramparts of King's Landing, the faint glow of torches dancing like fireflies. He felt something akin to heartbreak, though he would never name it as such. It was the city he had sworn to protect, the seat of the Iron Throne he had once believed in, even if only a little. Now he was an outlaw, a traitor in his sister's eyes, and soon the entire realm would know that Jaime Lannister had betrayed the crown. They spurred their horses onward, cantering through the dark fields under the moonlight. The humid air clung to them, but the north wind held a cooler promise. For hours they rode in silence, heading away from the main roads whenever possible, cutting across farmland and open meadows to avoid watchers. As the first pink fingers of dawn began to lift over the horizon, they paused near a deserted shepherd's hut, using the meager walls to hide for a few moments of rest. Sansa slid down from the mare, unsteady on her feet. Ned nearly collapsed, biting back a groan as his legs threatened to give out. Jaime dismounted swiftly, scanning the area. The farmland stretched in gentle slopes, dotted with half-dead trees. In the distance, a thin plume of smoke indicated a small village. "We'll rest here," he said, "but not for long. They'll be searching every road for us." Ned nodded, cheeks sunken from pain and exhaustion. He helped Sansa sit on a scrap of hay inside the hut. Jaime tied the horses just outside, then ducked through the low doorway. Sunlight streamed through the broken shutter, illuminating dust motes in the stale air. It was cramped and smelled of rotted wood, but it was better than nothing. He stripped off his gloves, flexing his fingers. "Check your wounds," he told Ned. "Make sure nothing's infected." He eyed Sansa's trembling form, then rummaged in his saddlebag. "Here." He handed her a half loaf of bread and a small skin of water. "We'll need to ration, but you must keep your strength." Sansa took them gratefully, offering some to her father, who drank slowly. Jaime felt their eyes on him, questions unasked. He let out a slow breath. "I know you want answers," he said, leaning against the hut's wall. "Why I did this, how we proceed. But we don't have the time for lengthy explanations right now. Let's just say that King Joffrey is not the king I can serve, and Cersei's plotting has become too dangerous for the realm and for me." Ned swallowed some bread, wincing as he forced himself to chew. "Whatever your reasons, you've taken a great risk. You realize we may end up fighting the Lannister forces if it comes to war." Jaime shrugged, though a heaviness settled in his chest. "I've realized that, and I accept it." He paused, pushing aside the memories of his father's cold judgment, Tywin's scathing words about Jaime's obligations to the family name. "But if you can keep the North from marching on King's Landing long enough for us to find another way, maybe we can avoid all-out war." Ned's gaze hardened. "I won't let Joffrey keep the throne uncontested, not when he would have killed me without a second thought. And there is the matter of the rumor of his parentage." Ned glanced pointedly at Jaime, but did not elaborate in front of Sansa. "If the rumor is true, he has no claim at all." Jaime's jaw tightened. "Yes, well, that's a hornet's nest I'm not eager to poke. Joffrey's claim might be invalid, but people follow power, not always law. We must be ready for the consequences if that truth becomes common knowledge." Ned closed his eyes, leaning back against the wall. "One step at a time," he murmured. "The priority is surviving the next days, then the next weeks, and ensuring Sansa's safety. After that, who knows?" They let the morning light deepen, dozing in brief snatches. Sansa remained near the doorway, her eyes distant, no doubt picturing King's Landing or her younger sister, Arya. Jaime avoided talking too much, partly from exhaustion, partly from the weight of all that had transpired. His mind churned with the knowledge that he had just abetted Ned Stark's escape, effectively defying both the king and queen. By now, word must have reached Cersei. He tried to imagine her fury, tried to picture the storm that would break over the realm. The Lannisters would close ranks around her, or Tywin would seize the opportunity to control Joffrey directly. And if Tyrion was in the city, well, perhaps the imp might see reason. if he survived the chaos at court. Jaime wondered briefly about Bronn, Shae, Varys, Littlefinger, all of them players in a game that had just changed drastically. Eventually, they roused themselves. Sansa ate the last crumb of bread, while Ned tested his legs. Jaime peeked through the missing shutters to ensure no patrol wandered near. Satisfied that they were alone, he returned to the horses, adjusting their tack for a longer ride. "We'll head north, but we should avoid the main roads," he said as Ned and Sansa emerged from the hut. "Keep west for a while, circle around until we pass the Trident maybe. If we're lucky, we'll slip past any watchers." Ned understood the plan. If they tried to cross the King's Road, they'd undoubtedly run into hostilities. "Very well," he said, voice quiet with grim determination. "I'll do whatever it takes to see Sansa safely home." They mounted the horses and set off again, following small footpaths across rolling farmland. With every mile put between them and King's Landing, the morning grew warmer, the sun climbing high. They occasionally spotted people working fields or tending livestock, but no one paid them much attention. 3 riders traveling with purpose, but not in shining armor or house regalia. Jaime kept his cloak draped to hide his golden handguard, and Ned wore a hood pulled low over his face. Anyone who got too close might still recognize the Kingslayer or the late hand of the king, so they tried to keep their distance, trotting by at a speed that discouraged conversation. By midday, they drew close to the edge of a small woodland that stretched across a gentle slope. A narrow track led deeper among the trees, promising shade. Jaime signaled for them to follow, feeling the heat beginning to weigh on them. The canopy overhead soon offered respite from the sun. A breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the scent of pine and moss. They followed the track until they reached a clearing with a shallow stream. Here, they paused to let the horses drink. Sansa slid off her mount and kneeled by the water, scooping it into her mouth, letting it trickle through her fingers. The tension in her posture eased slightly, though she still looked haunted. Ned splashed his face, wincing as the cool water touched bruises he'd likely not even known he had. Jaime kept his ears pricked for any sound of approach. It was quiet enough to hear birds calling high in the branches. For a moment, Jaime let himself believe they might actually succeed in this desperate flight. Then, in the space of a breath, an arrow thunked into a tree trunk just inches from Ned's head. A second arrow followed, landing near Jaime's foot, sinking into the turf. Instantly, swords were drawn and the horses whinnied, shying back from the disturbance. Sansa cried out, scrambling behind her father. From the shadows of the thick brush on the far side of the clearing, men emerged. 5, 6, maybe more. They wore mismatched leathers, no house sigils. Bandits, perhaps, or deserters from some lord's levy. One of them, a wiry fellow with a rust-red beard, raised his bow again. "Hold there," he barked. "We've got you surrounded." They advanced, forming a loose semicircle around the clearing. Ned pulled Sansa close, brandishing a sword Jaime had given him earlier, one of the guards' steel from the Red Keep. Jaime set his stance, golden sword at the ready, scanning the men's positions. The bows were the biggest threat. If they loosed arrows from multiple angles, one was bound to find a target. Jaime forced a smirk, letting bravado shield his fear. "You're making a mistake," he called out. The bearded man spat on the ground. "No mistake. You'll hand over your coin and those fine horses, or we'll kill you and take them anyway." Jaime's eyes narrowed. These were no knights loyal to the crown. They were outlaws, robbing travelers who strayed from the main roads. The question was whether they recognized Ned Stark or Jaime Lannister. Maybe that wouldn't matter if all they wanted was loot. But if they did recognize them, they might attempt to ransom them, another threat entirely. Ned's grip on his sword was unsteady, but the anger in his eyes was unwavering. "We don't want to fight," he said, "but we won't let you harm the girl." The bearded man chuckled darkly. "Oh, I'll bet she'll fetch a good price. Or we can just keep her for ourselves." Cruel laughter rose among the group. Jaime felt a burst of fury. Without thinking, he lunged forward, cutting the distance between him and the archer who stood at the front. The man tried to bring his bow up, but Jaime's sword slashed in a lethal arc. The bandit staggered back, an angry red line across his chest. An arrow flew wide, loosed by another bandit, whistling past Sansa's shoulder. Ned darted to the side, drawing one of the men toward him, exchanging sword blows that rang out in the forest quiet. Chaos erupted. The bandits realized their prey was not helpless. One tried to grab Sansa by the arm, only to have Ned's blade slash across his forearm, drawing a howl of pain. Jaime sidestepped another thrust, hooking his foot behind a bandit's ankle and sending him sprawling into the stream. He whirled, sword flashing in the dappled sunlight, blocking a blow aimed at Ned's unprotected back. Sansa pressed herself against a tree, breath coming in ragged gasps as the fight raged around her. She could do nothing but watch as Jaime and her father battled against the men. Fear and adrenaline mingled as she stifled a scream. More arrows came, two of them skittering harmlessly off rocks or sinking into the bank. A third clipped Jaime's upper arm, tearing through cloth and scoring flesh. He grunted, staggering, but kept fighting, gold pommel glinting with each strike. There were too many attackers, though. 7, possibly 8. Jaime's breath came in sharp bursts. Ned managed to kill one, driving his sword through the man's gut, but it nearly cost him his balance. Another bandit closed in, raising a cudgel to smash Ned's skull. Jaime pivoted, slashing, severing the man's wrist before the cudgel could land. Blood spattered across the ground. In the confusion, one of the archers took careful aim at Jaime's back. Sansa saw it before Jaime did. She called out, "Ser Jaime!" Her voice trembled. Jaime turned too late, eyes going wide as the bowstring twanged. The arrow flew, but Ned, seeing the threat, threw himself sideways, knocking Jaime down as the arrow whistled overhead. They both crashed to the ground in a heap. Sansa, emboldened by a surge of desperate courage, grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the archer. It struck him in the side of the head, not enough to kill but enough to break his focus. He snarled, turning his attention toward her. But Ned, regaining his feet, rushed him, sword raised. Another flurry of blows, and the archer stumbled back, blood on his lips. Jaime, cursing, pushed himself upright, ignoring the arrow wound in his arm. As swiftly as it began, it ended. 3 bandits lay dead, 2 more grievously wounded. The rest, realizing their advantage was gone, fled into the woods. The clearing was silent again except for the ragged panting of the survivors. Jaime scanned the tree line, making sure they weren't about to face a second volley. None came. The bandits had no stomach for a fair fight. Ned leaned heavily on his sword, breathing hard. Sansa, trembling from head to foot, ran to his side. Jaime clutched his bleeding arm, trying to gauge the severity. Blood oozed between his fingers, and the pain threatened to make him dizzy. But he stood, refusing to yield to weakness. "Everyone, all right?" he managed, voice thick. Sansa nodded tearfully. "Yes," she whispered, clinging to Ned. Ned pressed a hand to his side, wincing. "I'm alive," he said, though his voice was ashen. His gaze flicked to Jaime's arm. "We need to bind that wound." They moved to the stream's edge, adrenaline still coursing. Jaime stripped off the ragged remains of his sleeve to see a nasty gash. The arrow had grazed muscle but not lodged. Ned used the tattered hem of his own cloak to improvise a bandage, securing it firmly. Jaime forced himself to focus on the sting, letting the pain ground him. Sansa hovered, pale and silent, her eyes darting to the corpses strewn about the clearing. When they had done what they could for Jaime's arm, Ned sighed. "We should get away from here before more of them return." Jaime couldn't agree more. They retrieved the horses, which had bolted a short distance away. Sansa's was the only one that had remained somewhat close, trembling in the underbrush. Once mounted, they carefully skirted the bodies, trying not to look at the glazed eyes or the stench of spilled entrails. Sansa, face pale, turned away. Jaime's mouth was set in a grim line. War and violence were nothing new, but the stench of death still clung to the air like a memory that refused to be forgotten. They rode on, deeper into the woods, weaving among moss-laden trunks until the bandits' domain was well behind them. The afternoon sun began its descent, shadows stretching across the forest floor. They halted only once to let the horses drink and to sip from the stream themselves. No one spoke much. Each was lost in a swirl of emotion. Relief at having survived, dread of what lay ahead, sorrow at the bodies left behind. As dusk settled in, they broke out of the woodland onto a sloping plain. Far off to the west, the outlines of distant hills were tinted orange by the last glimmer of the sun. It would be dangerous to travel by night, but perhaps safer than camping in the open. Jaime felt fatigue gnawing at him. Ned looked even worse, and Sansa seemed ready to collapse in the saddle. Yet pressing on might be their only hope of avoiding detection. Jaime guided them to a small hollow near a cluster of rocks where they could conceal themselves. "We'll make a small fire," he said quietly, dismounting with a wince. "We need warmth, and we have to tend these wounds properly." Ned nodded. "Agreed, but only a small one. We can't risk drawing attention." Sansa helped gather sticks while Ned and Jaime cleared a space. Soon they had a modest blaze crackling, illuminating their exhausted faces. Jaime lowered himself onto a smooth rock, exhaling painfully. Ned eased down on a fallen log, letting Sansa curl up beside him. The night air turned chilly, a reminder that they were slowly heading north. They had little food left, only a portion of dried meat Jaime had snatched from the Red Keep's kitchens and some stale biscuits. Sansa ate mechanically, chewing without much taste. Ned forced down a few bites, then busied himself checking Jaime's bandage. The makeshift cloth was stained dark, but the bleeding had mostly stopped. Jaime hissed in pain as Ned poured a small amount of water over the wound to clean it. "Easy," Ned muttered, brow furrowed. "There's no maester here, Lannister. We'll have to do the best we can." Jaime forced a tight grin. "I trust you more than most of the maesters in King's Landing anyway," he said. Ned just shook his head, as though uncertain whether the remark was jest or not. A hush fell over them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the rustling of wind through the grasses. Sansa sat quietly, arms wrapped around her knees. Eventually, she spoke. "What happens if the Queen sends the Kingsguard after us? Or your father's men?" Jaime stared into the fire, face set. "They will eventually, but the realm is vast and we have a head start. If Tywin Lannister dispatches soldiers, they may search the major roads, but we're nowhere near those. We'll have to move carefully, keep to the byways until we reach safer lands. Perhaps the Riverlands. Though, the Riverlands are torn by conflict too, thanks to the tensions between my father and the Tullus." He frowned. "There's no easy way, but we have each other, for what that's worth." Ned gave a weary nod. "My son Robb might already be mustering an army at Winterfell. If we can join them—" He paused, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his bruised face. "But I don't want a war if it can be avoided. Too many will die. We'll have to see if there's a chance to broker peace. That might only be possible if Joffrey is removed from the throne, or at least controlled. The small council won't stand for what he's doing if it turns the entire kingdom against them." Jaime rubbed a hand across his stubbled jaw. "You have more faith in the small council than I do," he said. "Littlefinger's ambition knows no bounds, and Varys thrives on secrets. Grand Maester Pycelle is in my sister's pocket. Unless Tyrion returns to King's Landing and somehow outmaneuvers them, I doubt we'll see reason prevail anytime soon." Sansa looked between them, eyes glistening. "I just want us to go home," she said in a whisper. Ned drew her close. "We will," he promised, but the shadow in his eyes said he knew it wouldn't be simple. Exhaustion weighed on them all. They decided on a watch rotation. Jaime would take the first watch, then Ned. Sansa curled up in the warmest spot by the fire, drifting into a restless sleep haunted by the day's violence. Ned sat beside her, sword within arm's reach, eyelids heavy as he waited for his turn. Jaime stood and paced the perimeter of their little camp, keeping an ear out for any sound of approaching riders. The night sky was clear, countless stars shimmering overhead. Jaime remembered a time when he was young, sneaking out of Casterly Rock to marvel at the darkness and the scattered lights above. Back then, the world had seemed so vast, so full of possibilities. Now, it felt narrower, overshadowed by looming war. He looked at the silhouettes of Ned and Sansa, hearing her soft breathing. He had never expected to be guarding them. The irony was not lost on him. Once an enemy, the Kingslayer who had confronted Ned Stark in the streets. Now he was the only reason they had escaped a cruel death. The hours crept by in stillness. At one point, a fox darted through the grass, eyes gleaming in the reflection of the firelight. Jaime tensed but saw it was only an animal. Finally, he gently shook Ned awake to take the second watch. Ned rose with a groan, stretching stiff joints. Jaime sank onto the ground, letting the day's chaos catch up with him. His arm throbbed, and the rest of his body ached from stress and the minor scrapes of battle. Sleep claimed him quickly. He dreamed of the Iron Throne, the swords glowing red in the torchlight. Joffrey sat on it, cackling, while Cersei stood behind him, a twisted smile on her lips. The city was in flames, and Jaime was kneeling, shackled, labeled as a traitor. The dream shifted, turning into a memory of King Aerys shouting for wildfire, ordering Jaime to bring him Ned Stark's head? Or was it Tywin's head? All around, the hall burned. Jaime thrashed in his sleep, struggling to escape the weight of it. Then he heard a voice calling his name. He snapped awake. Dawn light filtered through the grass. Ned stood over him, face drawn. "We should move," Ned said, voice hoarse. "I let you sleep as long as I dared, but we need to go." Jaime blinked, pushing himself upright. Sansa was already gathering the horses, her movements careful but determined. He was surprised at her resolve. The events of the last day must have been traumatizing for a girl her age. Yet she was carrying on, fueled by the faint hope of reunion with her family and the desire to leave King's Landing behind. They doused the remains of the fire with dirt, scattering the ashes so no smoke would linger. Then they mounted up and rode once more, heading into the unknown. The next few days blurred into a fugue of travel, constant vigilance, and mounting fatigue. They skirted villages, passing wide of any smoke plumes that hinted of settlement. Occasionally, they traded a few copper pennies for supplies at lonely farmsteads, but they never lingered long. As they pressed further northwest, the land began to change. Rolling hills became more frequent, dotted with patches of dense forest. The nights grew cooler. Jaime's arm healed slowly, though it pained him in rainy weather. Ned's bruises turned a sickly yellow, but he recovered enough strength to ride without swaying. Sansa, with each passing league, regained a bit of her composure. Though she remained quiet, her once naive optimism dulled by reality. One afternoon, they spotted a crossroads. A weathered sign pointed one way to Harrenhal, the other to Maidenpool. Neither destination was promising. Harrenhal loomed in local lore as a cursed castle, and it was likely teeming with Lannister or Crown forces. Maidenpool was on the coast, heavily trafficked. Jaime studied the sign, lips pressed in a thin line. "We can't risk Harrenhal. My father's men might be there, and Maidenpool is too big." Ned nodded. "We continue on the lesser path, then." That path, unmarked, led through a forested region that would eventually cross the Trident. If they got that far without being intercepted, they might slip into the Riverlands proper. That was Tully territory, though the war might already be raging. Ned prayed that his wife's family would not be wholly at odds with the Lannisters, at least not enough to kill Jaime on sight. But that was a faint hope. They took the unmarked road, forging ahead. The forest canopy swallowed them, branches forming a dense ceiling. The smell of pine and damp earth filled their nostrils. Somewhere, a brook meandered, trickling water a calming note in the hush. Sansa's mare plodded along, ears flicking at squirrels darting across the path. Jaime's warhorse sniffed at the occasional root, lipping at the ferns. Ned rode slightly behind Jaime, scanning the surroundings. It was just past midday when they came upon a scene that made them halt. The remnants of a wagon lay overturned beside the track, its goods scattered. Broken barrels, torn sacks of grain, shattered crates. A pair of bodies lay in the grass, crows picking at them. Jaime's gut clenched. Another bandit attack, or perhaps the result of the growing unrest in the kingdom. Ned dismounted, carefully approaching, sword half-drawn. Sansa stayed on her mare, eyes wide with horror. Jaime approached the bodies, scaring off the crows with a wave of his arm. The stench was awful, thick with the reek of death. One was an older man, the other a young boy. Both wore simple clothing, probably peasants or small merchants. Their throats had been slit, and footprints indicated the attackers had rifled through the goods. Jaime grimaced, turning the boy over gently. The half-lidded eyes stared at nothing. He cursed under his breath, anger at the kingdom's state surging within him. Ned exhaled. The realm descends into chaos. With the king dead and no clear leadership, the outlaws run rampant. He closed the boy's eyes and muttered a quiet prayer to the old gods and the seven, covering the body with a piece of torn sackcloth. Sansa looked away, tears brimming. Jaime stood, scanning the area. "We can't do anything for them," he said grimly. "We should move on before whoever did this returns." He glanced at the wagon, battered beyond repair. A small cask of water was intact, and he retrieved it, offering some to Sansa. She accepted, though she drank with trembling hands. They continued, hearts heavy. After another mile or so, the forest thinned. They emerged onto a low ridge that offered a partial view of the surrounding countryside. In the distance, a broad river wound through the land, the Trident or one of its tributaries. That meant they were on the cusp of the riverlands. Even from afar, they could see smoke rising from scattered hamlets, signs of conflict or forced raids. The realm was in turmoil, no doubt. News of Ned Stark's escape, if it was widely known, would only stoke the fires further. They pressed on. Sometimes they followed faint deer tracks. Other times they skirted farmland, always trying to stay hidden. Nights were spent huddled around small fires or in abandoned huts, each dawn bringing fresh worry that Lannister or Crown patrols might appear on the horizon. But they encountered no organized force, only isolated pockets of bandits or terrified peasants. Sansa rarely spoke now except to ask about Arya or her mother. Ned did his best to reassure her, but the emptiness in his voice made it plain he was also worried for his wife and other children. Jaime, for his part, wrestled with a growing sense of unease. He had not heard from any Lannister allies, nor from Tyrion. His father's wrath would be monumental. Yet, for all that, Jaime felt more alive, more himself than he had in years. Each day was a new struggle, forging a tenuous bond between him, Ned, and Sansa, one built on necessity and a strange respect. Finally, after a fortnight of cautious travel, they found themselves near a crossroads tavern rumored to be a hotbed of travelers from all corners. Ned decided they might glean news about the state of the realm. They agreed Sansa would remain hidden in a nearby copse while Jaime and Ned approached on foot, leaving the horses tethered further away. If trouble arose, they would flee. The tavern was a squat, two-story building of weathered timber, set alongside a dirt track that merged with a more substantial road heading north-south. A ramshackle stable stood nearby, a handful of horses milling within. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a battered sign creaked in the breeze. Jaime and Ned exchanged looks, then entered. Inside, the common room was dim and crowded with rough-looking patrons. The smell of ale, sweat, and stale rushes assailed them. A few heads turned to regard the newcomers, but no one seemed overtly hostile. Jaime kept his cloak hood up, aware that his distinctive features might be recognized. Ned did the same. They made their way to the bar, where a harried innkeeper was wiping mugs. He eyed them warily. "What can I do for you?" the innkeeper asked in a low voice, glancing at the sword hilts peeking from beneath their cloaks. "Information," Ned said quietly. "We've been traveling, heard rumors of war brewing. Any news from King's Landing?" The innkeeper set down a mug, looking around as though fearful of eavesdroppers. "War's brewing all right. They say Lord Tywin Lannister has an army in the field, marching on Riverrun. Young Robb Stark is mustering the north. Word is that King Joffrey's calling banners to quell rebellion. But there's a rumor, too, that Ned Stark escaped the city, aided by some turncloak inside the Red Keep. Likely nonsense. The crown claims he was executed at dawn. The innkeeper shrugged. Who can say where the truth lies? All I know is that the roads aren't safe. Jaime and Ned exchanged glances. So the official story was that Ned Stark had been executed, no doubt to quell rumors of his escape. But Tywin's movements confirmed what Ned had feared. War in the Riverlands, tension at Riverrun, Robb Stark rallying the North. It was all happening, as unstoppable as a storm tide. Ned thanked the innkeeper, sliding a couple of coppers across the bar for his trouble. They retreated to a corner table, speaking in hushed tones. "My son has indeed called the banners," Ned murmured. "War is upon us, whether we like it or not." Jaime nodded. "We need to reach him before he crosses swords with my father. If we can present ourselves united in some way, maybe we can find a resolution that doesn't cost tens of thousands of lives." Ned looked skeptical. "Your father is not known for mercy or compromise." Jaime exhaled. "Nor am I known for chivalry. But we have to try." He paused, scanning the room. Another piece of conversation drifted their way from a table of traders. Talk of Catelyn Stark capturing Tyrion Lannister on the King's Road, a rumor that was old news but still relevant. Jaime grimaced at the memory of that fiasco. Perhaps it was the spark that lit the entire realm aflame. "We must go," Ned said quietly. "Back to Sansa. The longer we linger here, the greater the risk." They rose, slipping out of the tavern. No one followed, though a pair of men eyed them suspiciously. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched their shadows across the dirt yard. They headed back toward the copse, wary of any watchers. Sansa emerged upon hearing their approach, relief on her face. "What did you learn?" Ned's expression was grim. "War is nearly upon us. My father-in-law's castle, Riverrun, is threatened by the Lannisters. Robb is marching south. The crown claims I'm dead. They're lying to maintain control." Sansa's eyes widened. "Then, how do we find Robb?" Jaime looked to Ned. "We'll need to head toward the Neck and hope to intercept the Stark forces somewhere before they cross the Twins or the Trident. It won't be easy to locate them in the chaos, but they'll be heading south, perhaps already near Moat Cailin or beyond. If Walder Frey is involved, that could complicate matters." Ned gave a tight nod, helping Sansa onto her horse. "Then we go north quickly, but avoiding any major roads. We'll rely on rumor and hopefully catch wind of Robb's movements." And so they set off again, hearts pounding with the knowledge that time was running short. The war's flames were spreading, and they were caught in its center. Each mile carried them further from King's Landing but closer to the Lannister armies that would stand between them and the north. The tension weighed heavy on their shoulders, yet a flicker of hope remained that somewhere, in the convergence of armies, Ned Stark might reunite with his son and offer the realm a chance at peace. If Jaime Lannister's gamble didn't spark a greater inferno first. They rode on through the deepening afternoon light, determined to outrun the long shadow cast by the Iron Throne and the dangerous machinations of Cersei Lannister. In silence, they braced themselves for the trials ahead. The road stretched forth, uncertain as the dawn they had fled, and with each hoofbeat, they felt the wheel of fate turning. An unsteady alliance, a fragile thread that might just save them all from a darker destiny.